Well, good morning.
Good morning.
It is always such a privilege to be here. I think I told you this last time too, but I love Oklahoma. It's one of my favorite states, and a lot of people kind of question me that. Being from Colorado, my wife being one of them, she had never really visited Oklahoma all that much, and so this time she got to come with me on the plane. She's already back in Denver with her mother. They were out here for Comfier Cup, and some of you got to know her and my mother-in-law through that. But I remember as we flew into Oklahoma City, we went to the rental car agency, and they had booked a separate rental car at a different company, and I used my loyalty for my rental car. And as we're going out, they kind of looked at me as I was talking to the counter a little bit more, and I was explaining to the counter, look, you've got more muscle cars than you do economy cars, and by that persuasive speech, I was able to get into a Mustang GT. So I think she started to pick up on why I like Oklahoma a little bit more. So if you see me out there with the Mustang, that's not mine, it's just a rental. But after the Comfier Cup, she texted me and she said, man, the people out here are so amazing. They're so kind. They're so hospitable. She didn't know hardly anyone going to the event, and she felt right at home. So I think that's an homage to you guys and to the church here in Oklahoma. So I'm very happy to be here with you this morning. Being married to a kindergarten teacher brings about its many perks and benefits. One of those benefits is that my wife knows how to appropriately handle me whenever I have a bad day. Being a big man-child, she knows that if she just gives me an icy and some candy, that usually makes me a happy camper, and I'm good to go from there. But it also entails a number of different field trips within our marriage. And so my wife and I, we will go to various bookstores as she can get more books for her kindergartners. And I've grown to appreciate the bookstore. I've become a pretty regular reader lately, and so going in there and grabbing a cup of coffee and kind of perusing the theology section while she's looking at the children's books, and sometimes I'll wander over there. And about 2 months ago, we were in a bookstore, and I picked up a book by Shel Silverstein, not a theologian, children's book. And she was over there in a separate corner looking at some kids' books. And I picked up The Giving Tree. And I thought, I remember this book. And so I sat there and read through it with my cup of coffee. And by the end of it, I thought, what is happening to me? Because I started tearing up. And I thought, how is a children's book making me tear up? If you are familiar with The Giving Tree, it's the story of a boy who meets a tree, and of course it's a children's book, so you have some imagery there, and it's not supposed to be realistic, but it's all about the message. But he meets this tree, and he starts climbing up on this tree, and taking the leaves off, and making a crown for himself, and playing around, swinging on the branches, and the tree is happy that this boy has found such a pure happiness within this tree. Well, the boy gets older and he gets into his teenage years, and the tree asks, I haven't seen you in a while. I've been lonely. Where have you been? And the boy says, well, I need money so I can go out and buy some things. And the tree said, well, why don't you grab some of the fruit that I'm bearing, some of the apples, and take it into the city and sell it, and then you will have money and you will be happy. So the boy did just that. He grabbed the fruit from the tree, went into the city, and sold the fruit there. Some time had progressed on, and the boy came back to the tree, and the tree said, where have you been? It's been a while. Why don't you swing on my branches like you used to? And why don't you sit in my shade like you used to? And the boy said, well, I want a house. And the tree said, I don't have a house, but you can take my branches and build for yourself a house. And so the boy did just that, cut off the branches of this tree and built a house. And then some time progressed on. The boy finally comes back to this tree, and he's older in age, and he says, I want a boat that will take me far away from here. And the tree says, well, I don't have a boat, but I have my trunk, and so you can cut down my trunk, build for yourself a boat, and sail away. And so the man at this point did that, and he sailed away. And several years had progressed in the story, and an older gentleman came back to this tree, and the tree recognized him, and the tree said, I'm sorry, but I don't have anything else. You took my fruit, you took my tree limbs, and you took my trunk. I'm just a stump. And the gentleman said, that's okay. I just need a place to sit. And this story progresses of how this tree is giving everything that it has to this boy throughout his life, and you see the timeline of this boy. And I thought, we teach children what compassion is. And somehow the world distorts that compassion to where when you look at the news headlines and you look at everything that's taking place today, somehow compassion has been squeezed out of the mind of so many people. And so this morning, what I want to do is looking at the Gospel of Luke and looking at how Luke is writing to Theophilus, I want to show you 3 different stories. And all 3 of these stories are going to show one implication. And that implication is compassion is God's action. That any time that God sees someone in need, he is willing to extend compassion. Right now, I'm taking a course in school for graduate studies, and it's apologetics and ethics. And one of the biggest problems that people have with God that don't know God and don't know really much about the Bible is they say it seems like the God of the Old Testament is much different than the God of the New Testament, because the God of the Old Testament is this monster who's willing to kill anybody, and then you see the God of the New Testament showing all this love and compassion. And I would argue that God has never changed, that God is willing to show compassion to those who seek him. And we even saw that in Micah chapter 7, verses 18 through 20. But this morning, focusing in on Luke, Luke is going to bring out this phrase, seeing and having compassion, no fewer times than 3 times within his gospel. So if you would open your Bibles to Luke chapter 7, and this is where we'll see our first instance of compassion brought about by Jesus. In Luke chapter 7, we have this incredible story of Jesus coming into the city of Nain. And as he's coming into the city with his disciples, he sees for himself a widow. And she is obviously overcome with grief. She's overcome with sadness because she is standing next to the casket of her son. Now, I want you to understand, in the first century, even in the 21st century, it's hard to be a widow. And I know some here today are widows. We have widows who we try and take care of at Bear Valley. Being a widow is difficult. It's not something that I can empathize with, but it's something that I can sympathize with. But in the first century, if your husband was gone, there wasn't anything like life insurance. And so it was a very poverty and impoverished lifestyle to live as a widow. Not only that, but your support systems were increasingly small because, again, they didn't really have the church that we have today. And so you just hoped that they had a body of a community of some sort, whether that was Judaism or whatever else. But being a widow in the first century was increasingly difficult from today because you were poor, you had zero support system, there weren't support groups, there weren't counselors. It was very hard. And so often what widows would do is they would just kind of hope that their children could take care of them. And that's why we see that good religion is to take care of the orphans and the widows, because those people relied on each other so much. Well, here's this woman who is a widow, and so her life is already very difficult. But now add on top of that she has just lost her son to death. And so she's walking out of this gate. And the text tells us in Luke chapter 7 and verse 12 that it was the only son of his mother. And so this woman has gone through the grieving process of losing her husband. She is now encountered with the grieving process of losing her son. She is now trying to figure out, how am I supposed to live in life anymore? And notice what Jesus does in verse 13. When the Lord saw her, he felt compassion. We see, number one, with compassion, that compassion is present in grief. That far too often in this world, we see those who are grieving and we try to sympathize with them as best as we can, but then we kind of go on with our daily life. And Jesus, up to this point, has done a number of different miracles. He's already had several different teachings to his disciples and to the scribes and Pharisees. But Jesus sees an opportunity, and he's going to capitalize on that opportunity in order to extend his hand of compassion toward this widow. And look at what he says in verse 13. He says to her, "Do not cry." It is only our Lord and through the actions of our Lord that we can give such hope of there's no reason to be sad anymore. And maybe this widow was a little bit confused at first, but in verse 14 we see that Jesus came up and he touched the coffin, and the bearers came to a halt, and he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." In verse 15, and the dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. In 1 Kings chapter 17 and also in 2 Kings chapter 4, we see a similar situation of raising someone from the dead, both from Elijah and Elisha. And Jesus is now fulfilling such prophecies that he is the Lord of all creation, that he is the fulfillment of all prophecies. And that Jesus, just as the prophets did in the old, is able to show and extend compassion. It was the most encouraging and comforting words that Jesus could have spoken to this widow. Do not cry. We are reminded that compassion is present in grief. Jesus gave this woman back her son, but Jesus gave so much more than just a son back. Jesus gave back hope. Jesus gave back a message of God being with her. Jesus gave an incredible example to all those who were watching of what a great God that we have. Look at verse 16. Fear gripped them, and what? They began glorifying God. It was through Jesus' action of compassion that people were then able to glorify God. Were they glorifying God over the death of this only child of this widow? Were they glorifying God over this widow living her life? Rather, they were glorifying God because of what Jesus did. And of course, in verse 16, they said, a great prophet has arisen among us, and God has visited his people, paying homage to Elijah and Elisha. But Jesus was simply doing what God always does. And Jesus was showing compassion in times of grief. The second story that I want to show you this morning is found in Luke chapter 10, and it's a rather familiar story to us. It's the story of the Good Samaritan, what I like to call the compassionate Samaritan. Nowhere in here do we see that he's actually called the Good Samaritan, but rather the compassionate Samaritan. And so Jesus is trying to explain and tell the scholar of the law the answer to who his neighbor was. If you look at the context in Luke chapter 10, starting in verse 25, you'll see that in 25, this scholar of the law asked Jesus, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus tells him, basically short and condensed, that you are to love God and you are to love your neighbor. And this man says in verse 29, who is my neighbor? And so then Jesus starts this discourse of telling him this story of the Samaritan who was able to show compassion. And so we have three different characters in this brief story. In verse 31, we've got a priest. In verse 32, we've got a Levite. And in verse 33, we have a Samaritan. And so this guy, again, knowing his background, he's a scholar of the law. He's one who has studied God and Jehovah God for a very long time. He's one who is well versed in the Old Testament. He's one who is very familiar with what it means to be a priest and a Levite. A priest is one who is really just a mediator between man and God. If you were to sin in the Old Testament, and if you needed to make that sin right, you would go before the priest, and the priest would offer up this sacrifice and give this sacrifice to you, making that connection between you and God. The Levite, they were especially tuned into the worship of God. And so when you went to the temple, you'd see the Levites lined up there in the temple with the great assembly there in that complex, and they were leading the worship service. The Levites were also those who were very accustomed to God and his law as well. And so naturally, Jesus is going to portray these two in a negative light. Now that's contrary to probably what the scholar of the law is thinking. But he starts off the story in verse 30. He says, Jesus replied and said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, and they stripped him and beat him, and they went away, leaving him half dead. And so this was an unsightly vision to see. In verse 31, he says, a priest happened to be going down on that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Now, did the priest do anything inherently evil? And that's the question that we have to ask ourselves, because he saw the man in distress. He saw the man beaten and left for dead and stripped. And in rather of doing anything, he just kept on walking by. And then this Levite, likewise, also, when he came to the place and saw him, he passed by on the other side. So they were almost trying to avoid eye contact with this man, just caring about their daily life. And then who was it who decided to stop for this man? It was a Samaritan. And if you want to know more history about Samaritans, Ezra would be a decent place to stop and study. Because what we find out about Samaritans and Jews is that they hated each other. There was a rivalry between them, and it went far back into history. Sometimes we joke about the rivalries that we have today between OU and OSU. I was down in OU territory yesterday, and now I am probably up in OSU territory. There are rivalries that happen today, but I think there are even deep-rooted rivalries that we have today. Democrat, Republican. We have different nationalities. If I travel abroad, some people may look at me as, oh, you're a blessed American. Some people may hate me as an American. You've got rivalries and wars right now with Russia and Ukraine. I'm friends with many people who are in Ukraine right now fighting for their lives, and there's a rivalry there. But this rivalry of Jew and Samaritan went far back in history, far greater than just the first century context. And really what it came down to is the Samaritans thought that because they married into Jewish families that they were part of God's chosen people, and God's chosen people, the Israelites, were very proud of being God's chosen people. They were exclusive. And now these other people were trying to kind of nudge their way into that family, and they hated them for it. So much so that they told the Samaritans, you have no part in helping us rebuild the temple, even though the Samaritans wanted to help. So it was a hatred between the two. And so you have a priest and a Levite, both of which would have been very familiar with the scholar of law, and then you have this Samaritan. And he was on his journey, and he came upon him, and when he saw him, he felt compassion in verse 33. And so second, this morning, I would suggest to you that compassion is proactive in generosity. And the reason why I look at generosity is look at what this man did for this beat-up individual. Verse 34, he came to him and bandaged up his wounds, pouring oil and wine on them, trying to sterilize them, trying to get them to be as healthy as he could. And he put him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. Now, that would have been enough, right? Verse 34, we could have stopped the story there, and it would have been far more superior than what the priest and Levite did. This Samaritan stopped. That's even more than what the priest and Levite did. If the Samaritan even just stopped and said, do you need help? That would have been more. But instead, he went out of his way. He stopped what he was doing. He stopped in the middle of his journey. We are so easy to fixate the journey from point A to point B, wherever we're going in today's culture, that there is no stopping point between those. And we are just headed for a beeline to wherever we're going. But the Samaritan decided to take a detour and to stop and help this man. But notice in verse 35 that the story progresses. He does even more. On the next day, he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I, will repay you. So let's break down verse 35 real quick. On the next day, he didn't even have to do anything at this point. He pulls out 2 denarii, and if we understand that correctly, that's 2 days' wages. And so if you think about how much money that is, I mean, obviously it varies from person to person, but that's a significant amount of money for 2 days' wages to just be gone out of your bank account. And this man gives it to a stranger who he's never even met before, to someone who he doesn't even know, and he says, take care of him. Again, that was above and beyond. But what else does he say to the innkeeper? Any more that you spend, I will repay you. So he's already putting down more than what he should have as a Samaritan relating back to this Jew or to this individual. And then he says, even more than that, I will give you more. Just do what it takes to get this man back and healed. And so we know that from this account, that compassion is proactive in generosity. Now, we give on Sundays, and I think we get our command from giving on Sundays from verses like 2 Corinthians 8, where Paul is collecting up for the funds of the saints on the first day of the week. We understand 1 Corinthians chapter 6, that it's on the first day of the week that they gave. And that's a great collection, and that's a way that we can feel good about the money that we have, that we're not spending it on futility, we're not investing it in hopelessness, but that we are giving back to the church, that the church can support missionaries, or that the church can support in benevolence or whatever. But I would encourage you to maybe have a separate account, doesn't have to be big, but a separate account that's strictly for your ministry. People look at others who stand in the pulpit and they think that they're the minister. right? Definite article, that they're the minister. But Paul would encourage in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 that we have this ministry, that we're all in this ministry together, and that each of you have your individual ministries. And so maybe through a separate account or through benevolence or seeing a need and fitting that need or filling that need, that we can be compassionate by our proactiveness and generosity. Notice Jesus' command in verse 37. Jesus said, "Go and do the same." That when we see a need, we should fill it. That when we see someone who is broke down, we need to come and help them. Now, not literally broke down on the side of the highway, though that would be a decent opportunity. But sometimes there are those that we come in contact with where we know something's up, right? You can always tell when someone's a little shaken up or when someone's a little down or someone's discouraged. Stop your journey, visit with them, and see if there's anything that you can do. Sometimes giving isn't even a monetary expression. Giving could just be giving of time. It could be giving of energy. It could be giving of your resources to help whoever. So number 2, compassion is proactive in generosity. The third and last place that I want to look this morning in Luke's gospel is Luke chapter 15. And again, a fairly familiar story for people who have read through Luke's gospel. Luke chapter 15, we have 3 different stories that Jesus tells. You've got the story of the lost sheep, you've got the story of the lost silver, and the story of the lost son. They all start with S, so it's kind of easy to remember what Luke 15 is about. It's about those which are lost and trying to get that which is lost, having it come back to you, and then rejoicing for finding it. Well, in Luke chapter 15, starting in verse 11, we see Jesus telling the story of a man who had 2 sons. And we know that there is this account of the prodigal son who runs away. He first asked for his father's inheritance before he's even dead, which is something that wasn't very popular at the time. He takes that big lump sum of money and he just squanders it. When we look at Luke chapter 15 in verse 20 or in verse 30, we realize that this son has devoured your wealth with prostitutes and you killed the fattened calf with him. So we know that he's not doing holy things with the money, but rather he found himself in a predicament. He took all this money, it got to his head. He wasn't a good steward with that money. He wasn't giving it toward righteous deeds, but rather he was spending it on self and totally just wasted everything. Not only that, but he also wasted his resources as a worker, and he wasted his comfort of being in the comfort of his father's house and just being content there. The Bible has a lot to say about contentness. But what really gets me is the father's reaction to the son. The son wrestles with this idea once he's found in the slums of the pigs and he's sitting there, he's hit rock bottom, and he's trying to debate with himself, do I go home or do I stay here? Would my father even take me back? Would he even acknowledge me? And that's an appropriate expression to have when you've hit such a rock bottom. But look at Luke 15 and verse 20. He rose up and he came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him, and what? He felt compassion, and he ran and embraced him and kissed him. His father wasn't concerned about money, because guess what? Money will all burn up one day. His father wasn't concerned with his previous actions, because guess what? Those previous actions are living in the past. There's nothing you can do about that anymore. It's not like you can go back in history and erase it. His father was concerned with him coming home. And the father, upon seeing him coming home, embraced him. He kissed him. He was excited. He saw that his son had returned. But all those things stemmed from one emotion and one action. And it was the Christ-like action of having compassion. When we started this lesson, I told you that God's action is compassion. When God looks at his creation, when he looks at his people, God is looking down with compassion. God's not this horrible monster that some perceive him to be, waiting for a lightning bolt just as soon as you mess up, ready to strike you down. There is a judgment. But we read passages over and over and over again that God's love cannot be separated from us. There are times where we may choose a position of life that is not righteous, where we are straying from God. The Hebrew writer in Hebrews chapter 2 would even encourage us that we need to pay closer attention lest we drift away. There is that temptation. There is that reality. But we know Romans chapter 8, verse 30 and following, that God's love will stay there indefinitely. And that we're the ones who are walking away from God's love, not God. And that when we come back to God, guess what emotion God has? It's not one of, I told you not to do that, right? Have you ever had a parent tell you, I told you so? God's not ready to do that. But God's ready to embrace you. God's ready to receive you back. And God's ready to have compassion. When you look at Luke's gospel, especially in these three different stories, we see, number one, that compassion can be seen in times of grieving, that compassion is present in grief. That when we see those around us in times of grieving, that maybe it's time to start acting like Christ and just be present in grief. Even if we don't know what to say, sometimes our presence is the right thing to say, right? We see, number two, from Luke chapter 10 in the compassionate Samaritan, that compassion is proactive in generosity, that we ought to be people who are looking for the needs in this life to show people how we can extend the mercy of Christ. And then from Luke chapter 15, we see that compassion is powerful in grace. God has forgiven us. God has brought us back. And oftentimes, we're slow to give forgiveness to others. We're slow to show and extend that same grace. I'm so thankful that God doesn't treat us the way that we treat each other, because I feel like forgiveness would be a little bit few and far in between. But God is one who is powerful in grace. He's one who is a compassionate Father and one who is ready to receive anyone when they come home. The only thing that God wants is for His children to come home. And so I think that we can extend that compassion in a powerful and graceful way. This morning, I'll be available down here at the front as we sing this invitation song. If there's anything that I can help you with, I'd encourage you with that. If there's anything that you need help with outside of these doors, please realize that this is a church family. I know that I'm just a visitor this morning, but I know this church. I know Andrew, and I know some of the members here. And I know that this is a church family that is ready and willing to show compassion. If you have anything that you might need, please come forward as we stand and sing.